Hi, I'm Mark Lynch, Director of the Project on Middle East Political Science and the Institute for Middle East Studies at George Washington University. Welcome back to the POMEPS Conversations, our series of chats with the leading scholars in the field. And with me today is Hisham Aidi of Columbia University and author of the new book, Rebel Music, Race, Empire, and the New Muslim Youth Culture. So Hisham, welcome to GW.
Thank you, Mark.
So it's great to have you here because a lot of our interests overlap. Jazz, hip hop, Islam, the Middle East. So I'm really looking forward to this. Let's start with with jazz diplomacy and the campaigns of that the United States sent off into the Middle East back during the Cold War. I don't know if you know this, but we had a big event about this at GW a couple years back, and we had
Dave Brubeck,
right here, and so we've been looking at this for a while. So in your book, you talk about this a lot, and you uncovered a lot of things there that I actually had no idea about. So tell us a little bit about what you found about jazz diplomacy and Islam.
Well, there's a relationship. I mean, preceding the jazz tours, there's a relationship between Islam and jazz. And what I talk about in the book is that, jazz and Islam would interact starting in the 1920s and 30s with the Great Migration. And you get artists such as Yusuf Lateef, who I mentioned in the book and who was very kind to me, when I was interviewing him. His family, he's born in Tennessee. Part of the Great Migration, they settle in Detroit. And one day, walking through the Syrian market, he comes across a rabat, right? A particular instrument. And a friend of his with whom he worked in an auto factory, an immigrant from the Middle East, tells him that's the instrument that King David used to play 5,000 years ago. So Yusuf Lateef goes ahead and incorporates this and the argul and other instruments and creates a new subgenre of jazz, right? And this was a time when jazz was very internationalist. Jazz was linked and sympathetic to post-colonial movements, the idea of Afro-Asian solidarity, Bandung. And I talk about a book by Eric Hobsbawm. Many people don't know that Eric Hobsbawm was a very accomplished jazz critic, right? And he talks about certain, links between Islam and jazz. And he says, America's rapid expansion around the world is only comparable to the expansion of Islam, which parallels the expansion of Islam within the jazz world, right? So he makes this three-way connection, which is fascinating. And he talks about why a number of these artists were converting and embracing Islam. And in 1953, Ebony magazine has a front-page story on this conversion, on why a number of jazz artists are embracing Islam. Right? So I talk about this when I interview some elders in Detroit and Chicago. And
again, you have this fascinating anecdote about how this changes their racial categorization and
right. Given the barriers that many of these artists were facing in the 50s, a number of them, once they changed their names and they would don robes, Muslim robe and so on, and wear a turban, they found that they could go to places that they could not go otherwise, right? They would not get Jim Crowed. They would, people thought they were foreigners. They thought they were,
right,
visiting from another country. So this was one aspect, but there was more to the embrace of Islam than that, right? If you look at the biography of Coltrane, and if you look at Yusuf Lateef's biography, Islam brought a sense of structure. It linked a minority to a global majority, and so on. But the cultural cross-fertilization that takes place is amazing. And of course, the government decides to tap these jazz artists to send them overseas to improve America's image, right? And most scholars think that it was a great success, right? To me, what's interesting is what happened on the ground. Right. Once these artists go to these places. I mean, you have Dave Brubeck, as I meant, goes to Turkey. He's walking through the streets of Istanbul. He hears a rhythm, and it inspires his classic album, Rondo a la Turk. And he goes on to mentor a number of Turkish musicians. Likewise, I mentioned another artist, Randy Weston, pianist from Brooklyn, who would be selected for these tours. And these artists would struggle with the idea of representing the United States at a time when the Vietnam War is raging, at a time when Jim Crow was still existing, of being part of a public diplomacy initiative to counter Soviet propaganda and so on. And there was sharp ideological divisions among artists, some who would go, some who wouldn't. But Randy Weston, he would settle in Morocco. He would settle in Tangier, Morocco, which is...
And he becomes a key link in the Gnawa music.
Right, he becomes critical. You know, he settles, he does his tour, he goes to 14 African countries, then he goes to Beirut, he meets Sabah, he meets the Rahabani brothers, he loves Beirut, he's going to settle in Beirut, but then he has to come back to the States. He's invited for a final gig in Rabat, Morocco, and he decides he's going to settle in Tangier. Why Tangier? Because that's, if you think of the jazz diplomacy of the 1950s, Willis Conover's program, the VOA relay station was in Tangier, right? So there was already, you know, there were also these Les Caves, French sort of jazz bars in Tangier. So there was a small jazz community. He would go there, and he would become a link, unlike the other jazz musicians. He would become a link between jazz musicians and Gnawa musicians, right? And start collaborating with Abdullah Al-Gourd, who's a master, a ma'allim in Gnawa music. In 1972, they would have a very big Pan-African festival, and he would bring big artists, you know, from the States to perform. But this interaction, what's curious to me is this you know, the expansion of American music, the deployment of American music. In terms of Gnawa, what I talk about is jazz goes from U.S. to Europe and then down to Africa, Senegal, you know, in different countries. And the earliest, actually, one of the first Americans to write about Gnawa music was Claude McKay, right? Claude McKay, who was a Jamaican, American poet, novelist. And he visits from Paris, he goes down to Tangier, ends up living in Morocco for 4 or 5 years during the Harlem Renaissance, you know, following the developments of the Harlem Renaissance in local papers, you know, and he starts to write some amazing stuff about Morocco and about music, and he's one of the first to write about this. And what's interesting to me is that this Black internationalist archive, this Black internationalist tradition is today very useful, very inspiring to Muslim youth today. We're facing similar, you know, crises of belonging, identity crises, and hostility. I mean, you're facing state surveillance, xenophobic movements, hostile media coverage, and so on, right? So Black history has become an alternative, an inspiring, progressive alternative.
So the title of the book, you know, Rebel Music, is actually literally the title of the book. So you look at hip hop, and there's very clearly, at least in the classic era of political hip hop in the United States, there's very clearly an oppositional political message there. I mean, you talk to people like Talib Kweli, and they'll say that's what inspired them. That's what attracted them to hip hop in the first place. NWA, or, you know, if you want to get out of New York, Public Enemy. And so, you know, it seems to me that that's really woven into the DNA of how hip hop evolved as an art form and as a community. And then you get this, frankly, to me, bizarre idea of then sending hip hop out to represent the United States. And you have some pretty sharp thoughts about that, but about the value of that. But I just want to stick with this oppositional idea for a minute and how that relates to Islam. You know, and you know, how those two things go together in terms of the evolution of Islam in the Black community, the African American community, and then the emergence of hip hop in the African American community.
Look, I was in New York in the 90s. You know, I was a young immigrant kid running around Harlem, and you know, when you witness this, you know, this cultural exchange that's taking place, and it was phenomenal. I mean, the hip hop of that era, hip hop was countercultural. Hip hop was inspiring. Hip hop would introduce a number of people to Islam, and it would introduce people overseas to Black history, right? And there's these exchanges that take place. What happened to American hip hop? I mean, you know, Chuck D has his thoughts. There's a wonderful piece that he wrote called "The State of the Hip Hop Union." As for the idea of sending artists overseas, you know, I don't denounce these artists by any means. What's interesting to me is the dialogue that takes place where people say, we have to do this, right? In order to get acceptance domestically, right? You have to be patriotic.
You go back to, like, for example, you know, Talib Kweli and the Streets of Ferguson, or, you know, they just released this video, I wrote about it the other day, you know, kind of linking Ferguson to Gaza. I mean, to me, that seems to be a continuity in that oppositional spirit of saying, look, this is how we engage with America, it's how we engage with music, it's how we engage with the world. And you know, we can talk all day about the commercialization of hip hop and the rise of gangster rap and all of that, but still, I mean, there seems to be that that tradition that continues.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, there are people who are still working in oppositional tradition to this day. I mean, if you look at people like Brother Ali, if you look at Lupe Fiasco is still very much in the tradition of a countercultural, critical protest tradition of Black music. And that is, that is the music that resonates among kids, Muslim youth who are politicized and so on. One thing I do talk about is how the Bronx has emerged as a site, for Muslim youth who will travel. I mean, I mentioned rappers such as Medine,
right.
like rapper Medine. He will film his videos. He'll fly to New York and go uptown and go to all these different hip hop sites, whether it's Sugar Hill, 137th Street, or the Bronx, and film. So. The rest of the world associates American hip hop with the 90s and with the history of that era in the 80s. And then, of course, there are people who go up to visit Malcolm X's grave, And so the Bronx has emerged as a node in sort of in the political map or in the political imaginary of Muslim youth.
And sometimes it's very explicit. Someone like Rakim, for example.
Yeah.
I mean, this is not something which is veiled behind obscure
No,
iconography.
It's
very
explicit,
upfront, but that's also going up against the hip hop culture, materialism and misogyny, and a lot of other things that run through mainstream hip hop.
Right. I mentioned Chuck D, who says rap overseas today is more political. And I talk about Brazil. I talk about an organization in Brazil called Posse Hausa that was inspired to revisit black history in Brazil and the Muslim slave uprisings in Brazil through hip hop. I mentioned a gentleman by Honoré Amin who has this organization in Sao Paulo, in the periphery, in one of the favelas in Sao Paulo. And he says it was the the biography of Malcolm X and the hip hop that made me conscious of black history. And then he made Hajj at the age of 21, comes back and starts his organization, which is turning into a movement, right? And and in Brazil, what he would say, he tells me, he says, in Brazil, hip hop has the moral advantage over every other music, right? That's hard to say about the United States, but in Brazil, the hip hoppers are working with the PT, with the Labor Party, Lula's party, to deal with all kinds of issues, right? To deal with poverty issues and racial inequality and so on. So that spirit of the 90s still exists in other parts of the world, and that's one of the ironies that what I talk about in the book is also today you have Black Panther style movements emerging in Sweden, in Greece, in Britain, in France. And so that history still resonates, right? And so the globalization of American history, the globalization of African American history is something worthy of, worth looking at.
I mean, during the early days of the Arab uprisings, Tunisia and Egypt, a lot was made of the role of hip hop, El General, and people like that. Do you think that was exaggerated, or do you think?
I think in Tunisia, it did play a role, right? The fact that the government tried to clamp down. And then, he released this thing online, and then Al Jazeera picked it up, and it was played elsewhere. It did contribute to the infectiousness, to the cross-border protest aspect.
I still remember the first time that I went to Tunisia after the revolution, and it was playing on the radio, one of his songs. And I'd actually never heard a song like that on the radio before. In a place like that.
Right, and he has the people's backing, right? He has popular support. So to this day, no one can touch him. But I do think overall the role of hip hop was exaggerated, very much. The countries with the most vibrant hip hop scenes in North Africa and the Middle East are Morocco and Algeria, and they did not see uprisings, right? If hip hop is the causal factor, so to speak. It doesn't
have to be a causal factor. It's interesting though. I mean, this Palestinian hip hop is really interesting, and a lot of global connections. That was in that video that I was just talking about. That's the connection, right? From M1 of Dead Prez to Shadia Mansour.
Shadia Mansour is amazing. Yeah, exactly.
So I mean, it really is this globalized.
Absolutely, it's these tracks are made in different cities. People don't realize, right? Somebody will drop vocals in New York, send the track over to Boston, then they'll send it to Amman, and then it gets recorded in Cairo. I mean, it's so different artists, can contribute, but they're not physically in the same place. I do think hip hop can play a role in disseminating, right? And so hip hop was not the causal factor. It did not lead to the uprisings. At the same time, for some reasons, it's only hip-hop artists who are in trouble these days, right? You're not seeing rock artists. So the hip-hop artists tend to be at the forefront of political protest and political critique.
We're pretty much out of time, and yet I did want to ask you though about you wrote this piece recently about the ISIS hip hop guy and kind of the role that it plays in the really hardline communities. Say a little bit about that just before we wrap this up.
Well, given the situation with ISIS, we've been getting calls, people asking, is hip hop what's leading European kids to go overseas, right? And there was a piece, I think, in Politico or elsewhere that said 50 Cent may have played a role, and then you have people like Majid Nawaz talking about the role of NWA and polarizing him or whatever. Again, I don't see, everybody listens to hip hop. Right, it's difficult to pinpoint and say there's some causation there that it's the song that led them to do this. I mean, hip hop can, it educates, it raises awareness, it makes you conscious, it can lead to political movements. But I haven't seen, any reason to think that it was Tupac or 50 or whomever who leads people to commit acts of violence.
All right, well, I wish we could continue this, but we're already over time. So Hisham Aidi, Rebel Music, Race Empire, the New Muslim Youth Culture. Thanks for joining us.
Sure, thank you so much, Mark. Thanks for the invitation.